Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. If you've been working through a project or initiative, you may find yourself at this point where you know what changes you want to implement in order to solve the original problem. But how confident are you that those solutions are really going to solve the problem like you expect? If your changes are complex or radically different than your current process, or if they have a lot of risk or cost, then you may find some value in testing or piloting your solutions first. I'm constantly amazed at how many people implement major changes without first running a pilot or without even trying to follow a simple yet formal process for piloting those changes to ensure they get the expected results. In this lesson, I'll walk through some basic steps that you can follow for running a pilot. The cool thing about this is that these steps are essentially the same steps you'd follow when you finalize your pilot and are ready to fully implement your changes into the organization. So let's jump right into defining what those process steps are for running a pilot.
It's important to note here that the pilot process that we're about to go over is the same exact kind of process you would follow if you're building not only a pilot plan, but even an implementation plan. So even though through this entire lesson I'll be referring to the pilot plan, I would say that it's the same steps you would follow for a full implementation plan as well. In this case, the pilot plan usually comes first, so that's why we're addressing it from that perspective. But you can consider it to be synonymous with the implementation plan as well. So what is the process for planning and executing the pilot? Well, I believe a well-executed pilot is going to follow these kinds of process steps. That is, where you have an input into the pilot itself, and then a process that you would follow during the pilot, and then some sort of output or result coming from the pilot. So first of all, as an input, one of the first things you need is to build a pilot plan. The next after that, you need to execute the pre-pilot actions. And then for the process itself, where you're actually following through the pilot, this is where you begin the pilot and then you monitor the progress of that pilot. And then finally, after doing that, the output is you want to review the post-pilot results. So can a pilot be successfully implemented without following these steps? Well, of course it can be. However, there could be some risks there if you were to not follow through with some of these. So this is a way that's to help prepare you the most for the full implementation. They're a way that it can help unify the vision and communication of the team and those that would be affected by the pilot. As well, it's a way that can help build confidence that the right actions and measurements are being used for this pilot, and they can also help expedite the review of the post-pilot results and ultimately the actions for the full implementation. So the scope and targeted audience for the pilot must be predefined. So it's critical to ask yourself at this point, does the team already know what to pilot and where to conduct the pilot? If they don't know, then before the team can actually build a pilot plan, which is one of the inputs into this whole process, is they need to identify them and consider the following things. First of all, what are all the improvements that are expected to significantly fix the root cause? This is a way to ensure that they're included within the pilot. Also, what subset process or location has similar characteristics of the destination where all of the improvements will be implemented? So as an example, if you're deploying improvements across retail locations nationwide, then which few stores might represent the general performance, design, and demographic as most of the other stores? So that way you're getting a fair representation in the group that you're piloting it to, knowing that they fairly represent the population. However, if you ask yourself again that question, does the team already know what to pilot and where to conduct the pilot, and they answer yes, then you need to make sure that all the stakeholders are notified and bought in before you actually build the pilot plan. So all those stakeholders where the improvements will be piloted, they must be included, or you could risk some delays or possible failure of the pilot itself.
All right, now let's explore this process in more detail by digging into the first two steps.
Well, for these first two steps that serve as the input into the pilot, we're going to begin with the first step of building a pilot plan. This is a pilot plan that's very critical to the entire process for the pilot itself. And it can be built in a meeting where you have a team, again, who are following a separate 5-step process. Now, there is some complexity in actually building a pilot plan, so the actual steps we follow for that are covered in a separate lesson. So let's move on to the second step then as part of the input into the pilot. That is, we're going to execute some pre-pilot actions. So a pilot plan is only as good as the ability to follow the plan and make sure that all the action owners are accountable for following the steps that they're assigned. So this is where you might have a due date column on the plan itself that could be colored red, yellow, or green in order to track the progress for the actions that are assigned to the different owners. So as an example, you might have some legend like this that helps track for everyone the progress that you have in executing the pilot plan before the pilot begins. So if the pilot plan has many actions with many different owners, then you might want to consider scheduling some recurring meetings, like a meeting that's weekly or bi-weekly or even semi-weekly, in order to review the progress as a team to make sure everyone's on board with executing the actions they're responsible for so that you're moving the pilot in the right direction. Now, what if there's an action that's late? That is where it might show up as something that's red because it's some critical risk there. Well, then I would recommend trying to contact the action owner before the meeting starts, so that way they can try to complete the action and explain any delays so that you're not calling them out in the middle of a meeting. Now, for all the red or the TBD, like the to be determined actions that you might have included on your plan, then you should continue to ask the team for new dates to update the pilot plan so that way you're having fresh information on there. And also for any significant delays, especially if it's a delayed action, that's a prerequisite to another action, then make sure you discuss that with your team, what the potential impact is and the overall start date for the pilot, because it could have repercussion effects on that where it could delay the actual beginning point for the pilot itself.
Now let's wrap up this process by exploring the last 3 steps of the process.
While you're actually working through the process of the pilot itself, the third step you want to follow is to actually begin the pilot. This is the date to officially begin the pilot that should have already been defined and agreed upon by the team to begin with. The start date should correspond with the due dates that you've already pre-outlined within your pilot plan to making sure that all the actions are complete before that official start date. So it's generally helpful to define in advance the tentative stopping point as well for the pilot. Well, as an example, what you could do is if you didn't have a clear date, you could say that you want the pilot to be complete after a certain number of weeks or maybe a certain number of process iterations or after you've made a certain level of improvements to a key metric that you're tracking within the pilot itself. And the fourth step is you want to monitor the progress of the pilot. So there should be some recurring team meetings, like at least weekly, if not even more frequent than that, to help monitor the progress of the pilot itself. So communication across the team is going to be essential during this time to make sure that the pilot is actually catching and fixing any problems or errors that are incurred along the way. It may be necessary to even have short daily meetings and make sure you're catching all the progress and that you've got everything running smoothly within the pilot itself. So don't be afraid to have very frequent meetings as necessary. There should already be some key metrics to analyze for measuring the pilot's progress and impact. So it would be helpful to at least track those metrics at a daily level so that the trends are much more observable, where you can see the movement and progress being made throughout the pilot itself. Now for the final output from the pilot, what we want to create is some sort of review of the post-pilot results. The pilot results should clearly answer the following questions. That is, did the improvements resolve the root cause for the piloted area? And how much improvement was realized for the piloted area and can be expected for an extended rollout? That is, if it's fully rolled out, what can we see the improvements were for the pilot? How can we roll those improvements out across the entire area that's going to be affected by the change? And what unique or unexpected issues arose during the pilot that could risk the impact for that extended rollout? So based on the information that you collect from this, the team should confidently know if, when, and how they're going to plan to do that extended rollout. Now, if the team can't answer this, then it could be necessary to continue the pilot until you can get those questions answered. So at this point, where do you go from here? Well, if the entire team agrees to do the extended rollout, then I would recommend going on to the next step of building an implementation plan. As we mentioned in the beginning of this lesson, the implementation plan is going to be the identical thing as the pilot plan. You'd follow through the same exact type of steps, except you're going to be accounting for an extended rollout and not just for the piloted test. So continue with implementing the improvements, following the same process steps that you would have used like during the pilot itself.
All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
I'd like you to identify at least 2 different projects or initiatives within your organization that had involved some sort of implementation of a significant process change. And for each of those different project examples, try to answer the following questions. First of all, were the process changes piloted in advance? And if they were, then was a formal process followed for piloting those changes? And was the piloted area representative of the full area where those changes would be implemented? If they weren't, then why not? How did the lack of representation affect those implementation results? Now, how successful was the pilot, if there was one? And how helpful was the pilot in preparing for that full implementation, like finding unexpected risks? And how successful was that full implementation? If a pilot wasn't used before the implementation, then why wasn't it? and what problems, if any, could have been avoided if a pilot were done in advance.
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.